If you want to try out some interesting music that in 1981 was incredibly ahead of its time and now occupies the sonic space known as post-rock now, give a listen to the Durutti Column's LC. Released in 1981, it's an extraordinary testament to what the rock band was potentially capable of within the confines of musical composition. It's absolutely stirring act of creativity. I think sometimes it's easy to set parameters of what a rock band is capable of and deny it the experimental tendencies of other genres, which ordinary classical art music or jazz or electronic music now. For Durutti Column's sound touches upon all three of these areas and yet approaches it from the avenue of a rock artist. I think it's incredible now that a group from at this time that emerged from the epoch of British punk rock was determined to create such a bizarre, unusual sound, which today, if it were to emerge from today's world of recorded music, it would perhaps be motivated from a desire to see what everything that the modern production studio or after audio program software was capable of, whereas the Durutti Column had their canvas was simply their imaginations. It is fantastic. This isn't to say that they weren't employing the production studio heavily as they worked on this album LC in particular, although consider that this is not a group which would have an enormous budget to work with in the record studio by any means. I'll read out the history of the group up until and including the release of LC in 1981. The Durutti Column are an English post-punk band formed in 1978 in Manchester, England. The band is a project of guitarist and occasional pianist Vinnie Riley, who is often accompanied by Bruce Mitchell on drums and Keir Stewart on bass, keyboards and harmonica. They are among the first acts signed to Factory Records by label founder Tony Wilson. In 1978, Tony Wilson and Alan Erasmus, later partners in Factory Records, assembled a band around the remnants of local punk rock band Fast Breeder, drummer Chris Joyce and guitarist Dave Robotham. The name was derived from a misspelling of the Durutti Column, an anarchist military unit in the Spanish Civil War, named after Buenaventura Durutti. The name was also taken from a 4-page comic strip entitled Le Retour de la Colonne Durutti, The Return of the Durutti Column, by Andre Bertrand, which was handed out amidst student protests in October 1966 at Strasbourg University. On 25th of January, Vinnie Riley, former guitarist for local punk rock band Ed Banger and the Nosebleeds, followed some weeks later by co-member vocalist Phil Rainford, and by the end of February, bassist Tony Bowers arrived from Alberta White Lost Trios Paranoias. The lineup was short-lived as Rainford was sacked in July and replaced by actor Colin Sharp, who also became one of the songwriters. Rainford went on to produce for Nico and Sons of Arca. The Durutti Column played at the Factory Club, organised by their managers, and cut 2 numbers for the first Factory Records release, A Factory Sampled, a double 7-inch compilation, also featuring Joy Division, John Dowie, and Cabaret Voltaire. On the eve of recording a debut album, the band broke up after a dispute about Wilson and Erasmus's choice of producer Martin Hannett. Robotham, Bowers and Joyce went on to form the Mothmen, the latter two becoming members of Simply Red some years later. Sharp went on to form the Roaring 80s, SF Jive and Glow, and also dedicated himself to acting. Only Riley remained. With everyone's departure, the Durutti Column defaulted to Riley's solo project. Other musicians contributed to recordings and live performances as occasioned. Former Alberta I Lost Trios Paranoias drummer Bruce Mitchell doubled as co-manager with Wilson throughout their career in Factory for many years afterwards. The first album, 1980's The Return of the Durutti Column, the title inspired by a 1967 Situationist International poster that includes that phrase, was produced by Martin Hannett. Riley says, "He more or less got sounds for me that no one else could understand that I wanted, and he understood that I wanted to play the electric guitar, but I didn't want this horrible, distorted, usual electric guitar sound, and he managed to get that. The record featured a sandpaper sleeve, the quote ended, by the way. The record featured a sandpaper sleeve, like the title of the record, inspired by the Situationist joke, a book, Guy Debord's memoirs, with a sandpaper cover to destroy other books on the shelf. I didn't even know it was going to be an album, It was just the case of jumping at the chance of being in the studio. I actually didn't get up in time. Martin had to physically get me out of bed to get me to the studio. That's how little I believed it would happen. I was still doing late night petrol station shifts. I was even more amazed when Tony presented me with a white label. I was completely baffled. What, is this really going to be an album? You must be insane. No one's going to buy this. Then Tony got the idea from the Situationists about the sandpaper book and decided to do something with a sandpaper sleeve. It was Joy Division that stuck the sandpaper onto the card. I was mortified. The music was unlike anything else performed by post-punk acts at the time. Riley rooting himself in new wave with and attempted experimental things. The record contained 9 gentle guitar instrumentals. Later releases occasionally feature Riley's soft and hesitant vocals, including elements from jazz, folk, classical music, and rock. Riley says, I had a lot of classical training when I was young, guitar and formal training. The scales I write with and the techniques I use are classical techniques and scales, a lot of minor melodic and minor harmonic scales, which generally aren't used in pop music. Usually it's pentatonic. Hannett's production included adding electronic rhythm and other effects, including Birdsong on Sketch for Summer. The album was accompanied by a flexidisc with 2 tracks by Hannett alone. LC, Lotta Continua, Italian for Continuous Struggle, released in 1981, was recorded without Hannett and introduced percussionist Bruce Mitchell, Riley's most frequent musical partner and occasional manager. It was recorded on a 4-track cassette deck at home, which was slightly padded in the studio. The tape piece is intact, among the first crisp, professionally released recordings made cheaply at home. Wow. Impressive stuff indeed. Do check this album out if you're so inclined. Probably one of the very finest releases of the 1980s in my opinion. I really ought to explore more of the Durutti Columns discography. It seems like it'll be a rich and exciting, beautiful journey. Thanks again, my good and dear friends.